Good morning, or good afternoon, actually. It's not morning. Security and compliance theater. Let me get my timer up because there's no timer in here, so I'll know where I'm at. We're good. All right. It's me. I do parties. It's the old Marx Brothers joke. Like if I practice, it costs way more. But anyway, John Willis, Actually, I'm a Red Hat now, so I'm Jay Willis at Red Hat too. So. Done a bunch of stuff. If you're really interested, I've been involved with every one of those companies, and that's like only the last third of my career. I'm old too, right? So been doing this for a long time. But Ubuntu, I was early in at Chef, sold the company to Dell, sold the company to Docker. One of the founding members of DevOps itself, DevOps Days. DevSecOps, wrote the DevOps Handbook. I wrote 10 books, 10 startups over the years. And as of 3 weeks ago, I joined a new, what they call, it's a new program office at Red Hat with Andrew Clay Schaefer, Kevin Baer, co-author of Phoenix Project, and Jay Bloom. I'm just going to point this out. This is a book that I wrote earlier this year. I worked on it with Nike, Sabre, Mike Nygaard at Sabre, Capital One, Marriott, and PNC Bank. And so I'm going to come back to this later because this is sort of the second half of the presentation. So the thing is, so this is called the 7 Deadly Diseases. I'm going to focus in on what I call the deadliest disease of them all, security and compliance theater. It's something that about 2.5 years ago, I left Docker, and I thought, I'm going to really fix the industry. I've got all these tools, lean tools. And I found is every time I tried to use a prescriptive tool, it sort of got in the way of really getting the truth. Because what I really wanted to do is like, even the word DevOps got in the way, right? And Agile, people are like, I don't like DevOps. I'm like, good, because we're not going to talk about DevOps today. These were sort of abstractions, and what I really wanted is to figure out why you suck, right? What is that bad organizational culture that just systemically lives in your place? And these things just got in my way. I mean, I made a good living off of some of these, but the point is, when I'm trying to sort of do what I call organizational anthropology, so I do this thing where I go in for a month in a company and I talk to 200 people. I bring in notepads, they make fun of me. I don't touch anything. And I go back to a CIO and I tell them, hey, you suck. And there will be a day where I'll never be able to do this at Red Hat now, but put my feet on their wooden desk with a cigar and say, hey, John, how do we do? And like, you really suck, bud. But what I do is, so what I found too was I was doing this as I sort of de-prescriptivized myself from all the tools I thought were important. I found there was like these patterns, and I could actually learn a lot about your organization if I could just kind of, in my head, put these patterns down for myself. Now, it was cool to call 7's a cool number. Could have been 6, could have been 8. It actually works really good when you're submitting a presentation to call the 7 Deadly Diseases, but they were just patterns. And I've done longer presentations, and I'm not going to go into all the patterns here. So I've got other ones that I've talked, look me up, but about not understanding how work flows, multiple systems, like 10 ticketing systems with all different contexts, misaligned segments, right? Classic DevOps story. Tribal versus institutional. If you read the Phoenix Project, the Brents, these people that seem to have all the knowledge, and they're so busy they can't share it. Complexity, right? I jumped ahead. Incongruent organization design. I got a great story for you there. On kind of sort of Conways Law, not applied to like microservices. How about that? And then complexity. But here's the thing. Like I wish I could say 3 years ago when I left Docker, I was a genius and I figured out how this worked. When I actually sort of went into non-prescriptive mode of just having conversations, I recognized these patterns. And the one thing that just always happened, which was, it boiled down to your audits suck. And if suck offends you, I'll stop saying that word. But the point is, what I found was like these things funneled down to the end of the day when I'm sitting with the CIO, and I go through all this. I'm like, at the end of the day, what you think you're doing from a risk profile, governance, risk, and compliance, is fantasy land. It is compliance theater. Your audits are really, no, man, I'll open up the notebook and I'll show you why it's just nonsense. I call it a negative risk ROI. So in this presentation, I have other presentations, and actually I'm going to try to turn this into a full audio book because each one of those 7 could be an hour by itself. But we're going to focus on sort of how do I get to security compliance theater through this lens that I use to go in organizational forensics or anthropology. So how many people have heard the Abraham Wald story? It's a fascinating story. Yeah, a couple, right? So it's a fascinating story. During World War II, they sort of the Manhattan Project, and it was like down the street there was a project of statisticians and mathematicians to figure out a lot of things. How to use stat and math to win the war. But one of the things particularly Abraham Wald was working on was how to repair bullet-holed fighter planes, right? And so they do a lot of stats, what's the right metal ratio, where to repair, what would be. And at one point, Abraham Wald had this epiphany like, oh my God, everybody stop. We got it wrong. We're looking where the bullet holes are. They're the planes that are coming back. We should be looking at where the bullet holes aren't. All right, so this is a metaphor for what, I got this from Sidney Decker, of how I think, they call it survivor bias, but to me, it's the cognitive bias of, I want to see what, I don't want you to tell me what's great and what's bad. I want to figure out where the bullet holes are by having conversations, where the bullet holes, in other words, aren't. And so for those of you who read The Phoenix Project, it was actually based on a book written in the 1980s called The Goal by Elliot Goldratt. 20 years later, Elliot Goldratt did this Beyond the Goal. It's an audio-only book. In fact, it's the reason why I came up with Beyond the Phoenix Project. And in there, it's brilliant, right? He talks about complex systems and theory of constraints and his 20 years of learning. But one of the really interesting things in it was he asked this question. He says, how people think about complexity. And he said that physicists think about complexity then differently from just the rest of us. So he asked the question, which system is more complex? And so I'm not going to do this to you now, but what do you say? The physicist would say it would be system A, because there's more degrees of freedom. I would say, not a physicist, I don't think I'm lucky I got through high school, but the point being, I would say that for me, the system B is all that noise when I go into your company. The consultant come in and I don't do this, how good's your CMDB? It's fine, John, move on. How are you good on security and vulnerability? Fine, John, move on. Well, I don't do that because I learned my lesson. But that's all the arrows. That's a system B. Remember I said earlier, you can't Agile, Safe, or DevOps? Those are the arrows. There's sort of somebody's giving you their version of the complexity. What I need to do is, I don't want that. I know your house is burning down. I know you're not just sitting there drinking coffee. I know your CMDB is terrible. I know that Cloud Native and your ITIL staff are on different floors and they don't speak the same language and they take different elevators. So what I need to do is get the system A stuff going. Right? So that's what I'm doing. I'm trying to go in and I don't want you to give me your sort of abstractive answers. I got to sort of pull this. I got to sort of gamify it. Because that's where the truth, and this is what Elliot Goldratt talks about in Beyond the Goal, is how do you really understand complexity? And he would say there is no such thing as complexity. That's a longer debate. Free water for anybody who can tell me what this is related to? It's hard. I mean, it's a terrible question to ask you. I make it a little easier. It's the Struts 2 vulnerability that happened in 2017, the one that took Equifax down. And basically, it was a component called Jakarta. If you actually stubbed in a malware code in the script and it was an authorized machine, you're off the races, kill chain, you're dead. And basically, that's just a curl with that's how you could attack. And we've done workshops on this. So in general, this is basically how the Equifax breach started. Now, back to the fine dog with the T and no fire. The CEO said, the Equifax breach was on a single person who failed to deploy the patch. Done. End of story. Right? No. Not going to accept that. And the good news is sometimes our government gets it right. In the end of 2018, they had, this is insane. If you to see all sort of incidents in their glorious capacity, the government did a great write-up. The kill chain, more than you'd ever want to know. They got it right on Equifax. A lot of details, really cool stuff. And the thing is that what's interesting about this thing is actually, it's kind of a tale of two stories. It goes through all these things that happen, and even in the breach, in the report it says, well, at the end of the day, the person who should have patched the service didn't patch the Tomcat service. But like in there's like all this juicy stuff, right? And we forget the Conways Law. So one of the things that's in there is that the intrusion detection systems, like the things you've paid like millions and millions of dollars for on the edge to detect anomalies and stuff like that, had 18 months expired certs, every one of them, at the day of the breach. Now, that wouldn't have stopped it, but it took 4 months before they actually figured out what's going on. Maybe the $10 million you spend on boxes that were running, but couldn't work, because somehow the automation to update the search wasn't there. There's a notion of Conway's Law, like we hear it all the time, Conway's Law, but so it's not just monoliths and microservices. It really does stem from organizational design. And so what was really interesting in that congressional report, anybody tell me what does Conway Law have to do with that org chart? Come on, be bold. Mighty forces will come to your aid. The CISO reports to the chief legal officer. In fact, it's called pluralistic ignorance. Right? It's another cognitive bias, right? And so during the testimony, the CISO is asked basically, didn't you think there was something wrong with this? And her response was that, well, they knew what they were doing. Equifax was a big-time job, and I just figured they knew what they were doing. Right? But here's where it gets even uglier. When she was asked, here it says, is there any particular reason why you did not report to CIO your belief that the PII may have been exploited in connection with the security incident? I don't remember a particular reason about that. I didn't think about it. Of course you didn't. Conway's Law, and it's like glorious punch you in the throat. Like, she reported to the chief legal officer. I guarantee you she reported to the CIO. In fact, the CIO went on vacation the day they found out. Had she worked a 30-day cruise somewhere in like Mediterranean. It's in the report. I imagine if she worked for the CIO and said, PII, don't go on that cruise. Calm down, John. Capital One. All right, here we go. The attack itself was carried out by a former Amazon employee who, after leaving the company in 2016, maintained knowledge. Bullshit. It was the metadata server and a default WAF. Like anybody. In fact, all right, I don't know anything, but like if they were running cloud custodian or guard duty, it would have caught it. So this wasn't I love how the press made it like there was this FBI agent and this woman who was a genius, and it was like a Tom Clancy novel. Like, think about it. What was in 2016 that was so spectacular about hitting the metadata server because somebody put a default WAF in and forgot to configure it? There's nothing Tom Clancy enough about that. But, all right, so, I mean, that's it right there. My kids could do this. Curl something that Capital One, the WAF has by default bypass left on. So that dollar URL is, I don't care what you're doing there, I'm going to metadata server. And then, by the way, so here's the thing, right? All right. So I did external forensic. I wasn't in Capital One. I don't know exactly what happened going on, but I have other bank customers that gave me a lot of intel, and I think I'm pretty close to the mark here on what happened. Capital One is amazing for in-process cloud custodian. I mean, they've sort of paved the way for banks doing sort of DevOps and all this stuff. This happened to be a one-off. For whatever reason, they had to do an exception. And here's the thing, right? This is going to sound really weird, hurt your brain. But you need to have a process for out-of-process processing. They didn't have a process for exception out-of-process processing. I know that sounds sane, but the truth of the matter is, for everything they would have done on process, they're really good at this stuff. But for whatever reason, they had to go out of process to do this. And I can imagine the guy sitting around like, have anybody used a WAF lately? I used one 5 years ago. It wasn't mod security. It was mod security. Oh, good. What about an instance? Well, we've used this a bunch of times, authorized group. Next thing you know, you got bypass turned on a default WAF on an authorized system. And what do? You hit the metadata server and say, give me everything you got, bud. And once you get into metadata, if the metadata server thinks who you are, it's called server-side request forgery. This is our biggest problem in our industry right now. The bad guys just figure out how to fake who they are. You know, encryption on rest, I don't want to get into it. But if there are 100 people in the company that actually can decrypt, the bad people will basically figure out how to SSRF that person. This is a real problem. Like, I'm not even saying I know how to solve this. But if you're on an authorized system and you hit the metadata server, you're getting some really interesting stuff. So what I do is I spend a lot of time just sort of talking to a lot of people. And, you know, nowadays I really do focus on security. But, you know, going in, I'm like, oh, wow, this all looks like a security problem. And that's my book, right? It's funny. The first day I go in, people make fun of me. Nobody wants to talk to me. Notepads, what are you doing? Aren't you heard of computers? When I'm done, that book at one of the largest banks in the world, a CIO offered to pay me 10 grand for it. You don't get the book, because the book are all the truth of all what people tell me. I promise the people when they tell me the truth, I'm never going to reveal what they said. Or I'll say what they said, but I'll never point on it. Like, you can't buy that book. But, like, it's funny. And then on the last day, everybody wants to talk to me. It's so funny. Like, I get queued up. You know, I get COOs like, hey, does he know anything about agile budgeting? Can I talk to him at his 9 to 10 o'clock flight before he flies out the next morning? This is something I learned from Kevin Baer. So what I have to do first off is get some contextualization on what I think I'm going to hear. I took the edge. I want to just talk. I took the CIO and the leadership just to hear what they think, but I know it's wrong. So, it's not wrong, they just they don't know, right? And so this trick that Kevin Baer, the Phoenix Project co-author, said, you know, you go in, I get on the phone, I do these like all remote too. I'll go, they'll say, all right, John, here's what, no, I don't hear what you do, I don't care what you do. I want to ask you this question, give me the 5 things you think this company should be doing and you're not. And it like rattle things off and they're like, oh my God, I can't believe I told you that. Or you get like, wow, that was therapeutic, right? Now I get the framing for how to go in and try to figure out what's going on. And then I just spend a lot of time, and I want to my time, I want to make sure I really cover the security stuff. But the top 3 things I always find, and these sound like platitudes, but they're not, is toil, risk, and inconsistency. Right? And I got a 400-page book with notes and color codes going down to the page number and the quote, Bill, I would never say to CIO, Bill said this on Tuesday at 3 o'clock, that, by the way, you don't actually add policy because you don't want to add any more audit constraints. Quickly, the toil when it comes to security, I've got a longer version, is the dependencies, right? The dependency map is insane. I don't care how much you spend on scanning. The single large ratio is like broken. There's 5 nested dependencies. There's actors that are actually supplanting nefarious code. I don't know if you heard about the sort of crypto miner node thing. Somebody took a year to get commit authority because they knew there was a Bitcoin operator that used that node module. It scares the hell out of you, right? Those are the actors we're playing with right now. Idle and toil, this is that back to that. You really think you're doing all this stuff. You're really just adding like 25% of your budget in toil and not getting any safer. You're filling out forms, NFRs, all these things. If you watch Damon's presentation about John Allspar's sort of incidents of high priority or unplanned investments, moving on, risk. Martin Casado, right? So Martin Casado is pretty much attributed to the person who defined software-defined networking. He started a company called Nasiris, sold it to VMware, NSX. Now he's at Andreessen Horowitz. But he said this about 4 or 5 years ago. He said that in our industry, we spend 80% of our spend on perimeter-based and less than 20% on inter-perimeter. And the truth of the matter is, I've done a fair amount of study of adversaries. I wouldn't say I was an expert. They never heard of Barracuda or Palo Alto. They don't come in through the edge. They don't have to. Because these companies are so bad at their hygiene, you can sneak in the building, you can tailgate in, you can find an empty cube, you can start end mapping. So the most dangerous points of your company are not the things at the edge. There's somebody left an instance up over the weekend, forgot to kill it with an old Jenkins server, and bang, you're kill chained. Low attestation. I'll talk about attestation efficacy, and then configuration management, right? Like, this is our sort of new world of danger, right? Which is, a lot of the volume has been about library scan, vulnerability scanning, all this stuff, right? But now, misconfigured container or misconfigured Kubernetes, Like, these are the new risk profiles. And by the way, don't think that the adversaries don't know about these misconfiguration opportunities. And I'm not just talking about resetting the default password. I'm talking about very complex configuration items that are maybe you have everything battened down on a Docker container, but then you forgot to turn the flag on Kubernetes, and by the way, those security things don't work now. There's some really complex configuration, and I don't even get me started about Helm charts, and like, again, there's a lot of stuff out there. And then consistency, right? Like, that's also like inconsistent environments. I love, I'll go in, and one of the things I'll ask about is, I'll ask sort of the security people, like, can anybody, this is large banks, right? Can anybody tell me all of the highs and critical vulnerabilities that you have running in customer-facing systems right now? And if they can't, like, I don't know what you mean, like, there's a whole set of other discussions we're going to have. But they say, yeah, no, I think you could. I'm like, we don't have to do it. I trust that you do that. Do you have escalation policies? Yes. How long do you wait till that's where they fall flat, right? Like, these certain things, they take architectural design changes. But that's not even the thing, right? Because that's everywhere. The thing I love then, at the next question I ask, do you have a different policy for test versus production? Of course we do. Like, you forgot that part about the adversaries not coming in through the perimeter. They sneak in. Your most vulnerable systems are those test systems. So if you're actually going to have, you should equally have your policy across dev and test. I would argue you should have stronger policies, because those are the one place. You can do everything perfect. So the analogy somebody gave me is it's like water going down a hill. You can stop it, but it's going to keep finding its way down the hill. That's what we're facing with these adversaries. If you want to know somebody who's amazing at this, is Shannon leads over into it. So let's get into the sort of deadliest disease. That's sort of a quick version of the, again, I've got longer presentations on that at Botch Loop. My presentations, GitHub project has pretty much every presentation I've done in 10 years. But let's talk about the deadliest disease. So again, I said all through this stuff about, and the thing is, I'm giving you a shorter version of the 7 deadly diseases because I want to focus on security, but it is about, like, how do you get work through the system? How much work do you document? How come certain work doesn't get documented? Who made that decision? There's a lot of things that go on. How do you think about complexity and failure zones? Do you sort of embrace blamelessness, psychological safety? If you saw Damon's presentation, right? Just about everything he covered. So one of the things at a high level, right? So we start thinking about sort of DevSecOps or sort of shift left auditors or shift left security, right? When you go in, I always like saying this joke. Everybody laughs. Somebody said I should make a T-shirt out of it. I lied about suck because I'm going to use it again. How much you suck is a multiple of how many review boards that you have. I've seen XML review boards, architecture review boards. Oh, hey, you're not done yet. You got to go to it's Wednesday and it's raining review board. I mean, not when I'm joking, but I've seen 5, 6, 7 review boards to get code in a system in a bank. And they all happen instantaneously at the same time in microseconds. No. They have all these overlapping properties. This one's at Wednesday at 3. And if you get that on time, you might get the Friday one. But if you miss that one, you got to wait till the following Wednesday after. Just to get to the review board, it might take a week to code something. It might take another 5 weeks to fill out all the forms that you got to fill out. And then it's another 8 weeks to get through all the review boards. I mean, I'm not joking. Checkbox compliance, right? This is sort of this, I'll get into this sort of subjective nature of how we do audits today. We create change tickets. Bob says, I'm going to do this. And Bob has somehow figured out the whole complexity of a system, and he can document in 2 paragraphs how it's going to affect these incredibly complex systems. I'm joking, he can't. But he does anyway. And he passes that on to Sue, and Sue's like, yep, I think that. Oh, no, Bob, can you add one more thing about the DB2? And then this chain of events happen, and there's this like telephone game of humans trying to describe impossible complex systems to say how, that was my 25-minute mark, good, I'm ahead. To describe what is, anybody see Damon's presentation earlier? Below the line, above the line, only one person, unfortunately, yeah. Like humans can't describe the complexity of the systems we manage, just can't. Not large enterprises, not companies that have basically 2.7 trillion assets, right? Like, no human can. So what happens though? The auditor comes in and says, I want to see that change record for this. Oh, Sue told Bob to tell Tom to tell the, like, can I see the screen prints? I'm not kidding. They don't even trust the system. It's what I call subjective attestations. And that's how we pretty much operate. Vulnerability theater. How much do you spend on vulnerability scanning? 5 million. I've had 7 million. I got this one, this one. I mean, I don't care. You can AI and ML, you can TensorFlow, you can basically juggle on dynamite with flamethrowers. It is basically impossible to detect the complexity variation. I mean, you look at some of the software supply chain reports about how much open source is being used out there. And the dependency, you write 10 lines of code, it's basically 1 million lines. Some of those dependencies are 5 levels deep. I mean, your scanner is not going to catch. In fact, it's even worse. Your scanner, I hear people tell me, like, I hate those scanners. Why? Why do you hate the scanners? He keeps telling me I've got sort of SQL injection, and I don't do any database calls. Because there's some method, and I'm not saying there's some good ones on it, and you got to do it. But if you think that's your sort of backdrop for safety, big trouble. And in fact, all the things that you do that are not making you safe is what I call a negative risk ROI. A, you're not getting any value out of it, and you're stealing time for what could be positive risk ROI. So this is something I did a while back, and we regulated it. It's just, this is sort of the kitchen sink of like a DevSecOps. We're going to throw everything at it, and I think, a lot of what we've done and learned over the years is we have this kind of notion of a supply chain, and we have these gates, and green, 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 red, go back, green, 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 red, go back, and we constantly sort of iterate to get our sort of feedback and improvement. And really, a lot of what DevSecOps is about is just adding those sort of security things into those red gates. So make it just one stream. And that's what this is all about. I don't want to over-rotate too much on it. I have a feeling that I was sort of involved in the early discussions of DevSecOps, just like I was of DevOps. I think it's taken off on a course I'm not crazy about. So I've been really focusing back on, and I'll get to in a minute, in this automated governance, which I'll spend most of the presentation. Just a couple of things I want to talk about, sort of DevOps, SecOps, operational tips. The thing is, this came up in one of the open spaces earlier, right? Actually yesterday, is that if you're going to do sort of security project in DevOps and pipeline, get the policy people in the conversation at the story building time. Literally invite them in, let them help you design, because you don't want to finish it and then go to them and say, what do you think? Terrible. So actually getting the policy people in early, or your internal auditors, or your sort of, I make fun of review audits, but like banks have like ORMs and stuff like that are really important and can go out of business. We'll talk about subjective. Ruthlessly eliminate false positives, right? Like you have to be really good on that. A lot of systems will allow people to whitelist the user, like Nexus, and they'll have all these things. But then I go into people like, I keep sending it to them, and it never gets whitelisted. So again, these are sort of social technical problems. The technology's there to sort of whitelist the stuff that like you don't want to see all the time because it doesn't affect you. But if your system is so broke that the people you send it, first off, you don't have authority to change the system. The vulnerability scanning thing. And then the people you send it to never seem to put it on the list, right? Make sure that, you don't have different systems for your security stuff. James Wicker says a bug is a bug is a bug is a bug, right? Like if you use Jira, use it for everything. You should have a different system for sort of vulnerabilities. Anyway, so the part I wanted to talk about, which was this automated governance. And so the idea was, how do we change sort of subjective attestation, the Bob, the Sue, the whatever, to sort of objective? And so an attestation is evidence that you've done the things that the policy people say you should be doing. Right? All right, so the objective attestation. So earlier this year, I put together a project where we did this sort of, it was a 3-day sort of working group where it was Nike, it was Capital One, it was PNC Bank, it was Marriott, and it was Mike Nygaard at Sabre. And what we did is, he's at Sabre now, he's the release it guy. But the idea was really threefold. One, like a lot of our sort of DevOps arrogance is we're going to say, like, get rid of that cab, the change advisory board, and they're like, yeah, how? I still have to do audits. You don't give me the how. So the first thing about this was the possibility of defining a reference architecture so I can say, get rid of the cab, and here's how. 1. 2, most audits, the efficacy of audits are terrible. I mean, they're just terrible. You look at what people are doing, especially when you start talking about cloud native and deployment, and you look at what the governance and rules policy are for the audits, they're so disconnected. I've had like horrific stories. I'm one of the ones I love the best, right? There was a team in a bank that told me, John, if one thing you could do for me is every time we have to have a new project on Amazon, I have to do a whole write-up and present the write-up to somebody about the business continuity of S3. Now, somebody should laugh right now, because I think it's like 31 nines, and so I think I didn't take math, I didn't do it well, but like that's like every molecule in the universe except one, and then you lose your data. But they have to have that discussion every time they have to start a new release. All right, so efficacy. And the third is just like this is glorious that most companies take 30 days a year to do audits. Screen prints and all that glorious. So what if we could turn the efficacy from 30% to 90%? What if we can get rid of the cab? And what if that we can turn 30-day audits into half days? That was the goal of this project. And so it actually all started with Topo Pal at Capital One wrote a blog article way back when, and it was basically how they built pipelines. And there was this thing about control points. And the idea was that you had the evidence. It's very related to SRE, although it's not really SRE. Like SRE's come up a lot today. But in order to get sort of auto-deploy or auto-commit privileges, you had to show up that you could evidence, as a developer, you could evidence these things. And today it was like 16 or 70. Now it's like 30. But the thing is that, and this is all public knowledge, right? So the blog article is all public. I'd be real careful. Anyway, I'll just leave it at that. The point is, these control points, so if you think about the SRE contract, right? Like, you got a service, I'm SRE, you give me it and say, I'd like SRE to manage it. And I look at it and say, no, man. You got to put some more NFRs and operational things in there so I can manage it. You do that, we make a contract. Well, this was sort of a starting point of how they were doing it pre-SRE. But the thing about this evolved into, wow, if you're doing this anyway, what if we could, and those things were negotiated and talked to in principle with the policy people. So if you got all that and you're evidencing these things and we tell you these are things we want you to evidence, why not like start shoving them in sort of a data store and turn those into real objective attestations? Now, you don't want to use here, pro tip number 1, don't use the word blockchain in a bank. Because there's some teams like, who said that? You don't have it anymore. But it's basically some form of sort of SHAs in a list. Now, if you want to go all in on blockchain, or just I'll show you what we did. We kept it simple. The first thing we did on this project is we had to figure out how we were going to define the pipeline. And we didn't want to create the millionth one version of here's how a DevOps pipeline looks. That wasn't the goal. What we had to do is say, if we were going to think about an attestation model, objective attestation model, what would be the best way to contextualize for our purposes, not for all of you, is how to really define what is the flow. And this is what we came up with: source, build, dependency management. Those have their own sort of loop, on their own. Package. And the package was interesting too, because as we get in the world now, right, in most cases, everything's a package. It's a jar file, it's a container image, or it's or it's some type of sort of AMI or instance that you're going to use on a cloud, right? I mean, there are variants, but in general, so we realized, that's a good one to have attestations around just packaging. So you don't normally see that as a separate sort of stage, and then you have non-prod. So that's what we did. In fact, this took the longest time, actually. Like all these experts and brilliant people in the room, and it literally took us a half day just to agree, like what would be the right model. And so the idea was that in sort of the process, then we would define particular attestations that would then be sort of hashed and sent into an attestation recorder, and then have some immutable record. So when we were all set, and by the way, so at that point, this whole thing started for me because I did a DevSecOps presentation at sort of JFrog a while back, and Kit Merker, who was actually at Google, and then he went to JFrog. He comes to me after my presentation, he says, "Have you heard of Gracias?" I'm like, "Yeah, I don't know. What does it do?" He said, "Oh my God, this would be perfect for what you're talking about." And I got to thank him, because I started down this path. So it was an open source project from Google. It's really a reference architecture, but it was really simple for us because it allowed you to sort of put SHA attestations. It's like a CRUD model for metadata. It was really defined to do a lot more, but for our purposes, it was really nice. In the prototype, we took the idea of like one sort of simple Java microservices, like get client name or something like that, in a container that we would try to put in Kubernetes and use Critis, which is a real simple sort of tool that works well with Gracias. And so we'd fill out all these things and it'd either get in. And we were just trying to prove, does this make sense? I mean, literally, we started on Monday like, this might be the craziest idea. In a day and a half, we might have walked out and get mad at John, like, why did you waste our time? I mean, we really didn't know if we were actually going to be able to get a working model. Good news is we did. And so the model that we came up with, and like it's great to have UML people on the team, right? But we came up with sort of, this is the basic guideline for each stage. You have your risk controls, you have an input, output, actions, and actors. So we built the model, and that book that I pointed to is Creative Commons. You can download it, IT Revolution. It has glory to us. So we'll see what my time is. We'll go through a few of those. So what do I got? We started at 25. I don't know. I don't want to do it. It's too late. My head is burning here. But source code, so I don't go through. At the end of the day, it was really cool. So like if you read all the attestations in the book, no one customer do this. But it was a kitchen sink of sort of Marriott, and everybody was throwing in their sort of what we did. Actually, Microsoft was the other one. Sam Guggenheim at Microsoft was on the project too. Like Azure DevOps, you heard of it? Like he was behind it, right? So you look at like what we went through and like the risks, but the real cool thing, the controls were the attestations. Like the peer reviewed had to be some percentage of unit coverage, unit test coverage, clean dependencies, scan for sensitive information, static code. Input was request for change, output was new version. The actors, actions. And then it went to the build stage. You go through the risks. The controls was sort of build configuration and source control. It had to come from that, no other way, right? Of course, immutable build on output, upstream approved dependency store. It was unit test, there was linting, and there was static security analysis, right? And so imagine each one, again, with 6 companies putting all theirs in, you wouldn't have probably start with 75 attestations. But think about a cherry pick of those being immutable SHAs. And imagine the build log. You tar the build log, you SHA it, and you put it into the chain. You tar the commit log, you SHA it and put it in a chain. And this is the reason why when an order comes in, let me see, like, here's the token. It's immutable, it's math, and if it's broken, everything else in the bank breaks, because RSA encryption is dead. Quantum transparency is won, right? Of course not. Like, that's the point is, like, and we've talked to auditors about this. We've actually, Gene Kim has run these sort of projects, DevOps Enterprise Summit, we've brought in the big 5, and we've had discussions. They like this idea. First, I thought they were going to hate this. They don't want to be in your place for 30 days. They'll charge you the same amount of money if they're there half a day. They love this idea. So we went through each one of these, the dependency management stage. Some screens I had to fit in. This is all in the book, but download only from approved sources, license checking, right? Security checking, quality, aging. So one of the companies this was a requirement of the aging of how long it was in repository. Brilliant, right? By the way, in the Creative Commons booklet of this, it's a course. Because every one of these is described by these experts. So it isn't just the blog. Every one of these has a little paragraph of each one of them. I mean, you could hand this to a junior person, say, read this and come back. And you just came out of college, you work for me, read this first, come back, let's have a conversation. I mean, just that alone is incredible. I mean, the only credit I get is for getting all the people in the room. The package only comes with a pipeline or a trusted dependency. It had to have a vulnerability scanning. Depending on like if it's a container, was it digitally signed? Notary or something like that. Unique versioning, metadata. Like in some companies, like Netflix. I'm not going to act like I'm an expert on Netflix, but they had a real cool system where they had like they launched AMI, and a lot of got filled out in a metadata. You populate everything at the runtime, or a lot of the configuration, the zookeeper, blah list, that, right? But like I know a couple of companies, or one of the companies in this project, where they do the same thing with containers, where they build sort of everything you need, sort of containers with their own libraries and all that, and then they really sort of populate like 60% of it at runtime from something like a Zookeeper or a metadata server. So in their world, they had to make sure that that was an attestation that the metadata was fine. Like somewhere in here is about secrets, right? Like that you are there, are using Vault or something like that, right? So you can think of all these things that you'd want. Like in one case, we didn't go as far as, we just used very simply, again, we had 2.5 days, but we just used Critis to say if anything was broken, the chain can't get into Kubernetes from the policy administrator. But the idea, you could actually break the build, if you did a more mature version, and I'm going to try to I want to try these people to continue to do this, and I want other people to enjoy me. If you're a bank, we want to try it. We tried this reference architecture in three different ways. One was the Gracias, another was Hygeia, and then one was a homegrown system. So we've actually kind of verified that it actually works on 3 different systems. What I'd like to do is say, bring your system and let's verify it, right? But again, trusted metadata, right? Like nobody's sort of forging the metadata. Who's populating, Vault's easy, right? Because it's pretty straight, but if you're putting sensitive data or operational data in a running container, like want to make sure that the metadata server that's driving that is secure, authorized, right? Has all the things I need, right? Artifact stage, only allow from upstream trusted package, like you see that all day. It's immutable at this point, has a retention policy. And then I didn't do the non-prod. Non-prod is definitely different than the prod, but only trusted source artifacts, allowed configuration production, encryption, secrets, tokenization, right? This is where the metal meets the sort of road. Security, intrusion detectors, identity threats, testing, promotion, quality grates. Is it operationalized? Does it have sort of things does it have sort of app dynamics or something in dynamic, stuff built in so it can expose data, like drift management, change order, production access, so is there a break glass type scenario set up, right? Again, like we weren't saying like anybody should just do all 75 of these, but the point was these were 5 really big companies running really big infrastructure in production systems. Billions of dollars worth of revenue through Kubernetes. One company in particular, $60 billion worth of revenue through their production-facing revenue through their Kubernetes. Now, I'm not going to make fun of KubeCon, but when I hear kids standing on stage talking about how resilient their version of KubeCon, I think of this one company that runs $60 billion, and it's supposed to get $100 billion by the end of the year of their company's revenue through their production-facing Kubernetes system. So some of their attestations are in here. There's some other slides I wanted to add. They're actually in the book. So one of the guys, John Rezatowski on PNC, he was sort of my first victim in this. Like, do you want to do this? It's like, yeah. First he's like, I don't get it. And then he went nuts, right? So John is like this guy that I say that he Kafkas everything. I suspect if he has a automated coffee pot at home, he somehow figures out how to use Kafka with it, right? So we finished this thing in the 3 days. And then he actually went back and actually started trying to really implement his own version of this. So this is a reference architecture. We actually got all that captured back in the book. And the first thing he said is, I needed a guaranteed delivery mechanism. So we actually have sort of a working prototype described that not only is the attestation with Gracias and then, decrypted, but it's also he's built sort of a Kafka or, a guaranteed delivery model around it. Marriott documented their version. So there's, again, multiple versions, but so this thing's got legs, and it's kind of good if I enter. We can do a little QA, I think I have a little time, but one of the things I like is, I attribute back to JFrog, because they're the ones that sort of, they're really nice to me. I like their culture, I love their CEO, and I don't make any money for saying this, but the one thing I like is, there's this book, it's called Liquid Software, and Bruce, who's like this unbelievable developer advocate over there, and when they first came out, he wanted a quote from me, and he gave it to me. I have I've got my day job, I got my family, and then I got to read books for friends, right? But got it. But the thing is, and a lot of books kind of suck, right? Just be honest with you. And I thought Liquid Software, this is gonna have to suck, right? Like, sorry, I love you, Bruce, but this is gonna. But I kept promising him, damn, I promise I'll read it next time. I read it and I loved it. It's very metaphoric, but it's a brilliant, beautiful book about this world that we're going into of sort of liquid, and you know, I got 4 minutes left, but I just love, again, you're not going to learn how to do Kubernetes, but they do a little about Gracias and attestation, so they did documented that. And I just thought, it's a quick read, and I think it sets a stage for, like, you know, not only sort of everything's liquid, but how are we going to run sort of what I'm talking about, stuff like automated governance. If you saw Damon's presentation earlier, what he was talking about. I just think this book sets a nice metaphor on liquid, being sort of the metaphor of how we're going to do software. Anyway, thank you for sticking around this late in the day, and party up tonight, I guess. I don't know. Ciao.